Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Tali Rosenbaum.
And today we'll be speaking about the best-selling book by Laura Doyle, The Surrendered Wife. It's received a lot of attention lately, and particularly in the Orthodox community, because Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt, a well-known journalist, wrote an article in The Atlantic talking about how this book, which was written by a non-Jew, and its ideas has been adopted by many people in the Orthodox community. And it's an interesting dynamic, taking a book written from almost a Christian perspective and how it has been in some ways absorbed into Jewish thought.
You know, that's so interesting because the truth is that this is a phenomenon that has been studied. My neighbor, Dr. Yoel Finkelman, wrote a book about how Orthodox communities tend to take information that's out there and kind of appropriate it and fit it for the Orthodox community. It's a really interesting book. It's called Strictly Kosher Reading, Popular Literature and the Condition of Contemporary Orthodoxy. So I think that Avital Chizhik's point about this particular non-Jewish book appealing to the Jewish community is one that is part of a well-known phenomenon. But I think one of the things we'll end up talking about is why. You know, why is it that it has become so popular in the Orthodox community? But that's really a sociological question, and I happen to be very interested in sociology, but I'm also very interested in marriage and intimacy. So what I was hoping is that we could talk about the book, talk about what the goals are for the book, and if the book really does achieve those goals, and what are the ways to achieve real intimacy.
I should point out, when we say that it's been adopted by many in the Orthodox community, the operative word is many. There are a lot of people who reject it out of hand, saying this is completely not a Jewish approach, or perhaps even better stated, not a healthy approach, regardless of whether it's Jewish or not. So certainly this is not the new Orthodox norm. It's rather something which has been adopted by some people and is being claimed that it is a Torah approach, or it can be combined with the Torah approach. But that's not the only attitude. We're going to see some of that today. Frankly, Tali, when I first bought the book in preparation for this podcast, I expected just to hate it or laugh at it. And when I first started reading it, it wasn't as bad, quote unquote, as I expected. There were some good ideas in there. But then as I read it more, there were some things which I found, frankly, absurd and even troubling.
What's interesting, Scott, if you read the social media, and, you know, we put out a call for our listeners to give us some feedback if they've read the book. And I had seen things on social media about the book in the past. And what's so interesting about it is that you have one group of women who say, this book was amazing. It changed my life. It helped my marriage tremendously. And then there's another group that talk about how terrible the book is. What do you mean? Surrender? You know, be submissive? What kind of a book is that? And have a ton of criticism about the book because it really doesn't sound very good. And can this idea of, quote unquote, submitting or surrendering to your husband, letting him do whatever, letting him, another interesting phrase there, letting him do whatever he wants. Could this actually be what creates marital intimacy?
And even more than that, of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but even more than that, we even received some responses saying not only does it sound bad, but there are actual examples of people who were hurt emotionally or financially by following these ideas.
So that's very important because I do want to warn our listeners that we are going to be presenting kind of a nuanced approach to this book, but some people do get very triggered by the book and also by discussion around the book. And we are going to be talking about different kinds of relationships, including relationships where there may be abuse or domestic violence. So please be aware that if you're triggered in any way by this podcast, please feel free not to listen, but also this may encourage you to reach out for help in your community.
Thank you for that trigger warning, Tali. And now just a few things before we begin. Remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. Please subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate and review and leave a comment as well. Share this podcast and let people know about what we're doing so that we can continue to bring these important conversations further into the Jewish world. Please join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus materials, episodes, merch, and more. You can find the link in the description of this podcast and in the show notes. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. jewishcoffeehouse.com. Make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and TaliRosenbaum.com. And one more exciting announcement, Tali and I will be having a live event on June 7th in Beit Shemesh. It's an Iriya event brought to you by the Binyamin Library in the Meyerhoff Matnas. Exact details will be posted on our Facebook page, so make sure to check that out there. It should be a lot of fun. We'll be talking about Tali's book that she co-wrote with David Ribner, Ani L'Dodi, I Am for My Beloved. Again, that's on June 7th, so check that out as well. Tali, do you want to summarize some of the basic principles of the book as you see it?
What's interesting is that not all the advice is bad advice. Some of it is very good advice. The problem that I have with it is that, what's important to me is context. I want to understand what is the context. So I'm going to summarize some main points, but then I really want to talk about intimacy in general. The book basically states that you just got to stop bossing your husband around. You have to stop being this demanding, controlling shrew. And she basically says, when I first got married, I told my husband what to do and I gave him directions and I said, don't spend money on this because I was, women are more practical than men. And of course I did things better and I wanted him to do things the right way. And, he would sit around and watch TV and stonewall. And I realized that I wasn't getting anywhere. And so the way that I got somewhere was completely to change my tune. And I began to understand that these are the principles that will make you be a happy wife. And what's a happy wife? You'll have access to all the money you need if you want dresses or if you want to have nice vacations, because basically your husband wants to be the man who'll be there to take care of you. And, you'll be happy because he'll be good. He's going to be good. He's going to act nicely to you. So some of the things that I'm also going to quote, stop bossing your husband around. Now, I don't think that women should boss their husbands around, and I don't think that husbands should boss their wives around. So a lot of the places where she actually says some very good sound advice, I think is very good sound advice for both partners. She says to relinquish control of your husband, let him do what he wants, respect him, respect his thinking, receive his gifts graciously, whatever he gives you, even if you hate it. Pretend to love it. And even if you don't respect him, pretend to respect him. You want to express what you want, but without demanding it or asking for it. Rely on him to handle all the finances. He should be in charge of the finance, and you should focus on taking care of yourself. If you want intimacy or if you want friendship, that's what other women are for. Cultivate friendships with women. Stop asking your husband all the time to talk about his feelings. Men don't like to talk about feelings. That's a woman thing. And then she talks about principles which are really true. Like, it's true, you want to be vulnerable. It's important to be vulnerable and trusting and respectful and grateful and to have faith in your partner. She says, marriage is like a ballroom dance. Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, he leads and she follows, and his job is to lead and to make her look good, and she has to trust that he is in fact going to make her look good. If both of them try to lead, then they won't be in sync and they'll pull each other apart. Obviously, she said, you don't do this if your partner, if your husband is physically abusive, but if he spanks your child as a discipline, even if you don't agree, you don't get to leave the relationship because of that. You should know that if he's verbally abusive, it's because you're not respecting him. And if you respect him, it will put an end to his hurtful words. And then she says, I know it doesn't seem fair that you work so hard while your husband sits around and watches television, but trust me, he will transform, he will change. Respect his choices even if you don't agree with them. You have to calm down and not be a frantic shrew, no matter what he does. Apologize even if you don't feel sorry. Do your best to apologize. It'll feel odd at first, but soon it'll become more natural. Give up control. Chances are he's really a great guy, but if you nag him and criticize him, it'll crush his potential. I could keep going on, but I think you get the main points.
Can I just add one caveat there, which I think is fair? You alluded to it. I want to just extend it. She says quite clearly that if a husband is physically abusive to either you or your children, then these principles don't apply. You should leave the relationship. She also says if he is in the throes of addiction, he has an active addiction to whether it's drugs or alcohol or gambling, or if he's chronically unfaithful, those are all reasons why these principles don't apply and a woman should get out. Just in fairness to what she says, there's certain situations where you don't submit.
Right. So, what I love is the ability to learn from things, and I love nuance. I don't like to look at things as all bad or all good. This has been very polarizing, but I really like the opportunity to try and understand what might be good about it. And I kind of formed a theory as to why this sometimes may be a very helpful approach for some marriages.
Okay, I want to hear that because I also have my list of things I liked and things I did not like. So I guess, why don't you tell me first what your theory is?
Look, in general, I think that many of these principles do not fall in line with what real intimacy is. Real intimacy is about safety. It's about being seen. It's about curiosity about your partner. It's about authenticity. It feels like when you're in a real intimate, secure relationship, you're in that relationship with your wise adult mind. You can be calm. If we look at relationships, for the most part, you want things to go well. You want things to be harmonious. Sometimes there's going to be a conflict, so you'll get out of harmony, but then you're going to want to recover and restore it and go back to harmony. But you see, couples need to learn how to restore harmony, how to recover in a way in which each person feels understood by the other. So whether a couple is avoidant at the core or hostile and angry, the book doesn't address how to honestly recover from conflict and restore that harmony. So when I think about this setup of a relationship that she's speaking about, where you're in a marriage and you're just so angry all the time and so controlling all the time and so demanding all the time that you need to be told, stop acting that way towards your husband. You're not going to get what you want. There's no question that she's right. You're not going to get what you want by controlling and demanding and screaming. But my question is, I know that controlling and demanding and screaming is coming from a place of reactivity. And so my question is, what is the context here? Why does this woman feel the need to control and demand and be reactive in that way? There's anger there. There's frustration there. And we need to look deeper into what's happening in the relationship, because this is not a thrive relationship. This is a survive relationship. So I look at this book as a survival guide to an inherently oppressive or hierarchical type of marriage. In fact, what could also create this is a context where one partner has certain privileges and entitlements, and the other one feels, and usually the woman, feels a sense of injustice or unfairness.
I just want to make one comment about that. I'm really glad you said that, because at one point she actually addresses that question when she says, why would a woman want to control her husband? And I'm like, okay, this is the question, exactly what you're saying now. What's really going on? And she says, because she doesn't really trust that he can do it better. And I thought it's almost a tautology. You're just saying the same thing. I don't trust him. Why? Because I don't trust him. I don't think it even gets to the heart of what's really going on. So I want to hear what you have to say, Talia. What's really happening? What does that anger mean? Why does this need for control among those who have that need to control, where does it really come from? And what can we learn from that?
That's a great question. Exactly what's missing here is the context. There are many variables that contribute to controlling behaviors, and that's why the context is so important. I think that when we look at marriages, very often there is an ongoing power struggle. In fact, a lot of marriages have power struggles, and we have power struggles over, I would say, 5 main topics. Usually it's either religion, children, in-laws, sex, or finances. Those are the 5 big ones where there are power struggles. Now, she's saying respect your husband to take care of the finances, for example, because there's almost this inherent belief that the finances is something that he should be in charge of, when in fact, in some marriages, it really makes a lot of sense to do it together, or for the woman to do it just because you should do what you're better at. But to go back to that question that you asked, why would you feel so out of control? So there's a lot of reasons, and a lot has to do with how you feel in your marriage, sometimes because of stress from the relational dynamic, but sometimes the stress in the relationship triggers older wounds from childhood. And so we have to be really self-aware of what our traumas are, if it's abandonment, or if it's loneliness, or if it's rejection, or if it's not being seen or not being listened to. And that's why every marriage is different. And what she does in her book is she makes a lot of generalizations. She makes generalizations about gender. She makes generalizations about marital dynamics in general. And she gives a very kind of prescriptive way to be in a marriage, which to me could possibly be helpful if you happen to be in a marriage where you really don't have control. It's almost a way of taking control. It's a way of empowering yourself when you are feeling like you are in the one down of a hierarchy. And we do that. I mean, women do that. And also men do that. They take their control back whenever there's a power struggle. Because in any relationship, when one person is feeling oppressed, they're going to act out in some way. And sometimes it'll be aggressive, and sometimes it'll be passive aggressive. Sometimes it'll be by being controlling, or sometimes it'll be by secretly spending money or lying or acting out in some other way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it, because basically saying, in my opinion, obviously I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, but when somebody says, if you are too controlling, then you should simply stop controlling, you're sort of denying yourself what really is happening. You're just in denial in a certain sense, as opposed to trying to root out the problem at its source. What is actually going on here? You're simply denying the problems that led to it in the first place. So I thought that was actually a real problem with the book, that it doesn't deal with the deeper psychological reality that's going on in an individual. As you said, it's very generalized. It's about what's happening among all women, as opposed to in this particular relationship with this particular couple.
It's not just about the control issue. It's really about seeing your partner as an object rather than seeing them as a partner. I would say it like this. There's something about the book, and kind of having a bit of a sociology background myself, that reminded me of social exchange relationships, which I learned about in sociology, which is kind of like using the principles of exchange, which are market principles, fairness, equality, and putting them into a social context. So if you look at a relationship from the lens of social exchange theory, which is an economic theory, people will be in relationships and they'll be happy in relationships as long as they're feeling like their needs are being met and things are fair. So a long time ago, marriages were arranged, and in some communities, they're still arranged. But a long time ago, marriages were arranged. They were arranged based on all kinds of factors having to do with families and convenience and value sharing, etc. And two people were, in fact, objects to each other. And, the expectation is that you will manage to grow a relationship together. And if we believe that Judaism values that, re'im ahuvim, then we believe that that's the expectation and that's part of what should happen. In some marriages, it doesn't happen. And part of it is because there's a real disparity in personality, disparity in values even, or interests, or no tools to kind of figure out that intimacy. So when we're talking about building intimacy, we're not talking about how to manage our partners so that we get what we want. We're talking about how to understand and see and impact our partners, and also be impacted by our partners. Everybody wants to have an impact. And I think that this is another reason why, for so many people for whom this worked, so to speak, I think it worked because it gave them a feeling of having impact. I started acting this way, and in fact, my husband became much nicer to me. So now I have impact. She also talks about using your feminine wiles. Like, if you need help with something, don't just say, "Can you please carry the box into the room?" But you should say, "Oh, honey, I'm so weak and you're so strong. I need you to carry the box into something like that." And I think that this also goes back to something very traditional, or I would say patriarchal in a sense, that women had certain strengths in terms of what they could bring to the relationship. And one of the things was their sexuality, and they could use their sexuality to kind of get what they want. But really, when we're looking at modern relationships, we're looking at partnerships. And if we're looking at really wanting to have a healthy partnership, we really don't want to have a situation where you have to kind of use these methods of, I would say, surrender. Surrender is a good word, in fact, because when do we surrender? We surrender when we're losing. When we're losing a battle, we're going to surrender. We surrender in a war. We surrender in a fight. But surrendering doesn't mean submitting necessarily. It means this is what I'm going to do in order to survive. We surrender to survive. And that's why I think that this book appeals to women who are really in a situation that the way it's set up is such that if you're going to survive, this is how to do it. Because otherwise, you're going to be very, very lonely. And it very much goes along with the standard traditional patriarchal kind of culture where women hung out together to get their needs met, their intimacy needs met, their friendship needs met. When I see newly married couples, often the complaint is that I don't want to be having to make meals and do laundry for this 18-year-old immature young man. I want to be with my friends. I want to be with the people that I know how to have intimacy with, not this guy who I don't know, who doesn't speak, doesn't know the rules, doesn't know what to do. And I think that we could really help in this situation, not necessarily by giving the script, although this does give the script, but by teaching about curiosity and authenticity and building a relationship together.
So let me tell you the things that I found good about the book. And in fact, it's some of the basic principles that you listed before. The idea of relinquishing inappropriate control of her husband. Well, she says inappropriate control, and I think a husband should relinquish inappropriate control of his wife as well. I don't really understand why this specifically is going on the husband, except that this book was written for women, so fine. I think it probably can go both ways. She respects her husband's thinking. Of course, respect is important. Receives gifts graciously. All of these ideas I agree with. I think there's no problem there. The one that bugged me, and I'll get there in a moment, was when she said as a fundamental principle, which gets back to the idea of the sort of patriarchal society, relies on him to handle all household finances, which I think is something quite different. An additional thing which I thought was a good idea was the idea that controlling one's husband or one's spouse is a sign of disrespect. I think that when a person inappropriately tries to control somebody, you're basically saying, I don't trust you to do anything. And it's almost, it reminded me, when my kids learn how to drive, I'm a terrible driving teacher. I can't take it because I'm terrified sitting in the passenger seat. She gave an example of a movie where Robert Redford sat in the passenger seat and put his hat over his face. And I definitely relate to that. Meaning, if my kid is ready to drive, I have to let that kid drive. If you don't have the respect that they can drive, then don't let them drive. But you can't have it both ways. To have them in the car and say, okay, you're ready, and to freak out every 2 feet, which is what I do. And I see that as a problem. You have to have that respect. Control is a sign of disrespect.
I think that's a great example because basically what she's saying is get in the passenger seat and don't look, let him drive and trust him, even if he's a really bad driver. And the truth is that our survival mechanisms are there to protect us. And if you are in a car with a really bad driver, even if you say to yourself, I'm not going to be afraid, your emotional brain, your amygdala, which is part of the limbic system in the brain, is going to detect fear and threat, and you will go into your fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, when we talk about marriage, when we talk about couples and couples therapy and marriage therapy, I often have a approach that looks at our nervous systems when we interact with each other. Because the way that we want to be able to interact with each other is not in fight or flight mode. Fight, flight, freeze mode, the stress response mode, or some may call it the trauma response mode, is not a relational place to be. When we're in that place, we're anxious, we're triggered, we're angry, we're reactive. And obviously when we're in that place, we're not the best partners. We're the best partners when we can be calm, when we can be relaxed, and we can be in our, adult wise brains. So the way to get there is with a good driver. My husband is a great driver, so I can relax in the car, but only because he's a great driver. If you were a bad driver, I don't think I could because I wouldn't really have the trust. And so to have the trust, your kind of amygdala has to not get threatened. And that only happens with these embodied experiences of safety. And so it's very hard to kind of do what Laura Doyle is asking you to do because our bodies don't work that way. Our stress responses don't work that way. So she's actually telling people, and this is where the danger part can come in, to ignore or internalize their mechanism, their instinctual fear response. And this is where if you're already in a submissive culture, or you're already given all kinds of message that you don't have power and that you have to stay where you are, Laura Doyle's not knocking on everybody's door and checking if they're in an abusive relationship or not. She's just saying, well, don't do this if you're in an abusive relationship. But, people don't necessarily know if they're in one. Their fight or flight responses are telling them that they are, but she's telling you to just not do that without really looking into the context of why you are.
And that gets back to the large problem of how sweeping these recommendations are, how generalized they are, which is one of the things I strongly disagreed with. And let me mention some things that I disagreed with as well, which are related to that. Because if it works for a couple and that's their marriage contract, that's fine. I don't disagree with anything, really. If they are happy that way, if it works for them, then go for it. But because it doesn't work for everybody, that's the problem when it's sort of presented as a blanket recommendation or requirement for everybody. So, for example, she talks about if your husband, let's talk about driving. We just use that example. Another driving example. She said, even if your husband misses the exit, even if he's going to drive the wrong way across the state line, don't say anything. Okay, if that works for them, that's fine. But why would she recommend that to me when if I were going that way and my wife knows the directions and I don't, I would want her to tell me you missed the exit.
She's doing that because her belief is that it is your job as the wife to be engaged in the building of your husband's sense of self, his ego, his confidence. It's not assumed that he has that coming in. And so you can either be the person who's going to, this is kind of like the enmeshed model. You can either be the person who's going to destroy his confidence, or you can be the person to build up his confidence. I kind of call this part of the book the How to Raise a Husband part of the book, because it really does infantilize the man in the sense that he's really unable to handle any kind of feedback. And you teach people how to be. And if that's the message that you're constantly hearing as a man, that you can't be expected to handle any feedback, that's the culture or the toxic masculine message that you're being socialized with. That's how you're going to end up being.
Exactly. So in that sense, that's another problem I had with the book, was the implicit disrespect of men. To say that men can't handle being told they're wrong. Frankly, I'm like anybody else. I don't love being criticized. There are times when I really want my wife to tell me, don't do this. This is a bad idea. In fact, Tali, you know that before I release many of my podcasts, I often have Elisa listen to them because I say, I really respect your opinion. Is there anything in here that you think is going to be problematic or that you don't think is correct or something along those lines? If I knew that every time, no matter what I say, she says, as Laura Doyle would have it, whatever you think, she'd be violating our marriage contract. I want her respect. I respect her respect and her opinions. So even the example she gives, don't tell your husband what kind of haircut to get. You know what? I want my wife to tell me what kind of haircut I'm going to get. She's the one who has to look at it.
How many choices of haircuts do you have?
There's short and shorter and shortest, but still.
Oh, okay.
You should see my pictures in high school. It was slightly less shorter, but still. I think that the idea of surrendering control of the finances to your husband is perfectly fine if that's the way it works in that particular marriage. But I think every marriage has
and
its
also
own...
if you trust your husband to run the finances, it can take a great burden off of you if that's been your experience.
If it works for you, that's fine. But if it doesn't work for you, what kind of blanket rule is this that the husband should always be in control of the finances? I wonder if that comes from an evangelical background in the sense that the husband's the head of the household and that sort of belief system. I'm not trying to say it is. I don't know. She doesn't say that. She doesn't directly connect it. But she does have a whole chapter about surrendering the financial control. And I think that really is up to the couple. Beyond that, Tali, one thing which I found troubling was the preponderance of anecdotal evidence. It's quite clear from this book that Laura Doyle had a very bad marriage before she started implementing these ideas. She makes it clear, unless she's exaggerating, but she says that her marriage was not good. Then she started doing this and her marriage shaped up, which is great. And she gives all sorts of examples of other people who had mediocre marriages or trouble in their marriages. They surrendered to their husband and lo and behold, everything got better. But to me, it felt very unscientific. You can have many examples, hundreds of examples where it worked, and that doesn't prove anything given the 6 billion or 7 billion people in the world.
Well, she's not a researcher as opposed to
that's part of the problem.
Couples therapy is, for the most part, based on research. And we have John Gottman, who has collected a great deal of data. And when we as couples therapists work, we really try to look at what is the dynamic of the couple. We say the more, the more. The more you do this, the more I do this. And every different couples therapy approach works differently. Like, let's say you're doing EFT, which is emotional focus therapy. So we talk about what is the couple's dance. Or if you're doing imago therapy, you talk about what drew you to your partner. What wounds feel familiar and in what way do those wounds get healed by your partner. If we're talking about, other methods, Gottman, which is certainly about, what predicts a good marriage, a healthy marriage, and what predicts failure. And he talks about, positive interactions versus the negative interactions. Or, I personally am a big fan of Terry Real. Terry Real talks about how marriages thrive when partners are equals, because hierarchical arrangements don't work, because when you're in a hierarchy, there's always a one up and there's always a one down. And the one down is always trying to climb up to get on top. And then the one down then climbs up to get on top. And there's a constant battle. There's a constant power struggle. And so the idea of equal partnership, the idea of mutual respect, but not the kind of respect that Laura Doyle is saying, that say you respect your partner even if you don't, but rather the kind of respect that's earned. The idea that a man would prefer for his wife to say, sure, honey, whatever you want, whatever you want, whatever you want, makes it sound like the man wants to be married to somebody who has no opinion. And I would think that if you're married to somebody, you would be really interested and curious about their opinion. But again, the way that this template would work would be when the interests between the man and the woman in the marriage are so far apart that there really isn't much of an expectation that there be that much mutuality. It's more like, what will make this work and what will make you happy? And what makes you happy is, whatever it is you need, which is the freedom to make your decisions to some extent of what you want to buy. He'll be less controlling. Basically, you build him up. You tell him how much you trust him. His identity is all wrapped up in wanting to make you happy and which is true. I think men, for the most part, do want to make their wives happy. I don't disagree with that. But since his identity is so wrapped up in it, the more you say to him things like, that's not like you to have such a temper, when you know he has a temper, that's like the positive reinforcement to get him to maybe not be as much of a rager in the marriage, rather than be able to say, what I would say in this situation is, let's sit down and look at what's going on in the marriage. What's making you rage and how do you trigger each other? Because if it's about your marriage, it really generally and ideally requires both partners to be present, to take accountability for their part in the dynamic. I also think we need to recognize that that's not always the case. That's not always the case. Sometimes a partner refuses to work on the marriage. And in those situations, she's right that you can't change a person. You can only change yourself. So again, it's about survival.
Right. When there's nuance, I think those are very good ideas. It's funny when you talk about what seems to be in the book, this desire for a partner, the husband wanting a wife who always agrees with him. As I was reading it, I was thinking the same thing. My mind kept on going back to a movie from about 32 years ago. I was just graduating high school, the Eddie Murphy movie Coming to America, where he plays a prince with an arranged marriage, which he's trying to avoid. And at the very beginning of the movie, he meets his proposed fiance and he asks her, like, what things do you like? And she goes, whatever you like. And everything she answers is, whatever you like is what I like. And that was what bothered him. Now, I'm not going to take muster from Eddie Murphy, but at the same time, that's what I was thinking as I was going through the book. She's suggesting that husbands want to be like that Eddie Murphy character who want the wife to say, whatever you want is what I want. And the movie was all about saying, that's not true. That makes people unhappy.
In fairness, I think that one thing that her defenders would say, no, she says specifically that you do need to say what you want.
Right. That's true. She says, say what you want, but don't demand it of your husband. That's true. I'm being sweeping, and that's a fair point. There was something else, Tali, which I actually found positive and interesting and very much in line with Jewish thinking. And I'm curious what you think about this. And that's the chapter on sex. And there she actually suggests something, which it seems to me at least, is very much in line with the Gemara in Eruvin Daf Kuf Amud Bet 100b. She says there that a woman should not ask verbally for sex from her husband. Instead, she should do things that hint to it, that indicate that she's interested, by acting very feminine, giving obvious hints, so to speak, rather than to actually say, honey, I want to have sex tonight. The Gemara in Eruvin says something very similar. It says, Ha'isha tovat belev, va'aish tovea b'peh, Zohi midah tova benashim. A man verbally requests sex from his wife, whereas a woman does it with her heart, meaning hints. That's how people seem to understand it. And this is a good attribute in a woman. Now, it's not quite so clear because, as you said to me before we started recording, it's unclear from the Gemara, and you're right, it's unclear from the Gemara whether this means that this is what a woman should do or this is her nature. You could really read it in both ways. However, the phrase, this is a good attribute in women, seems, at least to me, to imply that that's the preferred way that women act, that they don't request sex, rather they hint towards it. And this is the way the many Chatan teachers teach it as well. What's your feeling about that from a therapeutic perspective?
Yeah, Chatan teachers teach that. I think that also in the right-wing communities, the Kala teachers teach the women that if it's the night that you want to do it, or it's the night that you've determined it's a good time to do it, you should make a sign, put something on the bed, or you shouldn't say it directly.
And it comes from that Gemara.
Could be. Look, I think that just speaks to the cultural kind of patriarchal aspect of things. I mean, that stuff was written a long time ago when, marriages really were looked at in a certain way. And it kind of goes along with the Laura Doyle approach. I think that it really depends on the marriage. I think that saying, I want to have sex tonight may not be a very sexy invitation, whether the man says it to the woman or the woman says it to the man. I think the idea of not asking for it is really part of her request or her suggestion that women don't demand, that women use their kind of feminine wiles to seduce because it makes the man feel better. Although I think that I have heard plenty of men say, I just wish my wife would initiate. However she initiates, I just wish she would initiate. I'd like to think that she means don't demand, but I just think it's just another example of this kind of behavioral guide to marriage, which doesn't sufficiently appreciate and value the couple and what works for them and what's good for them and what could possibly trigger them and what is the sexual dynamic with the couple. There's so much depth that needs to be explored usually. And that's, I think, the big danger. Not only is it dangerous sometimes to follow marital advice from a book, it's also dangerous from her book because she specifically speaks against the idea of marriage therapy. She even wrote a book called Kill All the Couples Therapists or Kill All the Marriage Counselors or something like that. She doesn't really gain a lot of favor in the eyes of most couples therapists because of that.
With a title like that, I wouldn't think so. Yeah. That does lead, Tali, into the question of whether these Orthodox therapists, or perhaps I should say Orthodox teachers who claim that this is in line with Torah thinking, whether they're right. So the first thing is that on some level, it's impossible to say, because one of my pet peeves is when people say, Judaism says the following. And I've heard that too many times to count. Judaism says some things. It says you have to eat matzah on Pesach. It says God is one. There are certain things Judaism does say. When it comes to a lot of things in the hashkafic or psychological realm, Judaism says a lot of different things, and many of them contradict, and there are many different opinions. And too often I find that rabbis, educators, in the modern world will often, I don't mean modern as in left wing, I mean in the world today. I don't know what it was like a long time ago. And this gets back to the idea of cultural appropriation or cultural influence. What they'll do is, perhaps unintentionally, take the most prominent psychological theories or perhaps pop psychology, find sources in Torah that agree with them, and then say, see, Torah and psychology are saying the same things. I've seen people take modern Adlerian theories, point to specific sources in Torah, and say, look, at the moment Am Yisrael left Egypt and God gave them the Torah at Sinai, principles that were discovered by Adler 3,000 years later were already in effect. I could equally point to other ideas in other sources that say the exact opposite. So it's very hard to say what Judaism says. And very often what you're calling Judaism is simply taking the ideas that are outside of Judaism, good or bad, and then covering them with a Torah shine, giving almost this Torah language to them, finding the sources that seem to match. So it's very difficult to say that. I will say that my own understanding, and this is a reading that people can debate, but my own understanding that I've said for many years is that when God created Eve, and God says, Eselo ezer kinegdo, I will make a helpmate opposite him. Rashi there comments, very well-known Rashi. In fact, it was in Daf Yomi just this week that we're recording, in Yevamot, Daf Samach Gimel 63. Ezer means someone who helps, and kinegdo means someone who's against him. And Rashi's words are Zacha ezer. If he merits it, she helps him. Lo zacha, if he doesn't merit. Kenegdo lilachem. She is there to fight against him. And although one could say this is not the pshat, and I know some people say this is not the pshat, the following is how I understand this. Zacha means if he's doing the right thing, then she's there to help him. Lo zacha, meaning if he's doing the wrong thing, her job is to set him on the right path. In other words, either way, her job, at least in this context, as Rashi understands it, is saying, your job is to make sure your husband is doing the best he can. If he's doing the right thing, you should be helping him out. Join him in the process. If he's doing the wrong thing, fight against him. Make sure you go against him in order to make him go on the right path. That's very much not the surrendered wife. It's saying if he's doing the wrong thing, you should correct him. Now, is the wrong thing driving the wrong direction? My guess is it's probably more in the moral, ethical, and religious realm. But still, the basic idea that we never criticize our husbands, we never tell them our true opinions, it seems to me at least, this is not what Rashi's saying. Now, of course, I know someone might say that's not true. Lo zacha just means if he doesn't merit it. Unfortunately, he's an unlucky guy. He has a bad lot in life, and he got a bad wife, and therefore she's fighting against him. It has nothing to do with his own personal actions. It's not about he's doing something wrong, and therefore she should fight against him. It's just he got a bad wife. Okay, you could read it like that. That's not how I read it. And I think that if we're looking for a Torah approach of the surrendered wife, I would feel comfortable saying that it's far too sweeping and far too based upon Christian principles rather than Jewish principles to say this is the primary Jewish approach. Maybe it is a Jewish approach, but certainly to say this is the way Jews should act, as we've been saying all along, I reject that. It depends on the marriage.
The truth is that I don't think that there's a lot of guidelines regarding how to kind of be in a marriage in terms of shlom bayit. I think that a lot of that is construct that came later. I think there's so many different guides to how marriage should be done. And a lot of it, especially in the right-wing part of Orthodoxy, follows a certain agenda to kind of keep homeostasis in the system whereby there are very, very specific roles. This is what women want. This is what men want. And that's why the Frum community is not only drawn to books like Laura Doyle's book, but also to books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. They're drawn to a lot of things that seem to come from kind of these wholesome Christian sources. Even a lot of the addiction model programs, they are also based on more Christian models. I mean, they're similar values. And so I think that we can appreciate that, you know, we do come from an essentially patriarchal culture, and that's okay. I think that if anything, Judaism has tried its very best to protect women from the dangers of being one down in a patriarchal culture. And so when you look at the Jewish marriage and the kinyan and the ketubah today, when we look at it from today's eyes, you know, we can say what we can say, you know, why is he acquiring her, and why is she being mikudeshet to him, and why is it saying that only he has to be responsible for the food and shelter? You know, she works too. But this is tradition. This is how it is traditionally. But we also have to look at the society that we're in today and how changes in the social fabric are going to affect marriage. You know, she says, Laura Doyle, you know, even if you're a CEO of a major organization, put that behind you. Once you get home, you don't act like that anymore. But that is very dissonant. You know, women want to be valued for who they are, and men want to be valued for who they are. My big criticisms of this book, if you've noticed, are not about raging feminism. It's just as potentially difficult for men as it is for women. It's potentially unfair. It doesn't give them an opportunity to be seen, to be understood for both partners. As we start to wind down, I'd like to offer our listeners some show note stuff. I want to put a shout out to Elisheva Liss, who wrote a blog article. And also, I saw, and I started listening to their YouTube, Rachel Tuckman and Elisheva Liss. I also want to reference the Headlines podcast. Headlines is a more like yeshivish podcast that had a bunch of interesting speakers on the topic.
I thought that podcast was excellent. Just for those who want to know, it came out November 13th, 2021, the episode about the surrendered wife. I thought it was a very nuanced episode. It had people who agreed with it, people who disagreed with it. I wanted to make 2 points, one of them relating to what you just said. One, at the very beginning, they had Rabbi Zev Leff Shlita, who made a very important point relating to what you just said about Shalom Bayit, peace in the home, and Jewish sources on that. So I will say, before I get to what he said, or I hope I'm quoting him correctly, Shalom Bayit is clearly a Jewish idea. The idea of Shabbat candles on Friday night, it's brought down the sources, is important. That is a source of peace in the home. Having peace in the home is very much a Jewish idea. How you get there, that is something which Jewish sources are a bit more ambiguous on, and you can find people who say all sorts of things. So what Rabbi Leff said, as I understood it, at the beginning, he made clear that he is not a sociologist or a psychologist. He is an expert in halacha. And he said that humbly. He said, to a certain degree, he knows about halacha, but okay, he's an expert in halacha. He said, if he needs to know about sociology or psychology, he'll consult a sociologist or a psychologist and then see how halacha relates to that. And similarly, he would hope that a sociologist or psychologist would not consider themselves experts in halacha. And if they want to know something about halacha, they would consult someone like him to ask what that would be in a given case. This relates back to the idea that Jewish sources often don't tell us psychology or sociology as much as we would like them to. Rabbi Leff isn't saying, because I'm a Talmid Chacham, I therefore know psychology and sociology. I have to talk to people who are experts in the field, and then I can see how halacha relates to it. So to me, that's exactly the point that you're saying now, Tali, which is that Jewish sources, and as I said before, Jewish sources are on some level ambiguous or multivocal, and therefore we can't say the Torah idea is this. We have to talk to people like you, Tali, who have expertise in these areas, and then see how halacha relates to that. There are some Jewish sources that talk about how to achieve peace in the home, but they can be read in so many different ways. I'm not going to say it's almost useless, but it's not that practical for most people. So that's my first point about the Halacha Headlines podcast. The second one was that one of their guests is someone named Sarah Yocheved Rigler, who lives in the Old City, and she took some of the ideas in Laura Doyle's book and created something called the Kesher Wife Workshop. And she's been giving workshops for years, adapting some of the principles of the surrendered wife to Torah sources. And I did not listen to her workshops. I'm not part of them, so I don't want to define them. But only from listening to the podcast and from Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt's article, which also cites it, she says, among other things, something which I found quite disturbing. It's worth mentioning. She said that if your husband does something which bothers you, if your husband does something which upsets you, your attitude should be that this is coming from Hashem, everything's from Hashem, and everything in the world that happens is because Hashem wanted this to happen. Hashem is the only real reality out there, and if it happened to me, God is doing it in order to send me a message. And rather than get angry at my husband, I should take the attitude of, okay, this is part of my tikkun, this is part of my soul's journey. It's correcting something that needs correcting in my neshama, in my soul. And that's a perfectly okay hashkafa. I think calling it the Jewish hashkafa, which I think she does, is overly simplistic. There are many different ways of looking at it. Not everyone accepts this idea of tikkun of the soul in the same way that she seems to be saying it, but fine. But the problem is this can very much lead to basically victim blaming. It can lead to the idea of, well, my husband did something really bad. I mean, admittedly in the book, and I'm not saying that Sarah Yocheved Rigler would agree with this, but at least in principle, it says, if your husband beats you, you leave. But why isn't that the same thing? I could use the same principle. This is from Hashem, so I shouldn't get mad at my husband. Obviously, this is part of my personal tikkun. If my husband is yelling at me, verbal abuse, if he's doing something, if he's having an affair, whatever it is, I shouldn't try and correct the problem. The problem is in me. And while maybe it's empowering for some people to say the problem is in me and I can only fix myself, there are certain times, and I think Jewish law would unequivocally agree with this, there are certain times when you say somebody is at fault and that person should fix what he's doing as well. Otherwise, what's the point of police? Otherwise, what's the point of courts? Jewish law accepts that people do things that are wrong, and some things that are wrong need restitution. And I was bothered by that general attitude.
Well, Scott, what I have to say, and I feel bad because it's the end of the podcast, but what was coming up for me is that we have all sorts of defense mechanisms to survive whatever we are kind of dealing with in life. And, what we say in couples therapy is you're in a situation and you're unhappy. Okay, maybe it's all the things that you said. Your partner betrays you, and has affairs, or is abusive, or is any of those things. Now, you have two choices, right? You can either leave the marriage, choice number one, or you can decide to stay in the marriage and you can do what you can to change because you can't change your partner. Everybody wants choice number three, that the other person changes, but in these kind of relationships, there is no choice number three. Choice number three is only available when you're in a relationship that's safe and both partners are motivated to make those changes. Now, think about, why would somebody choose choice number two? They would choose choice number two Usually because choice number one is not really an option. Now, why is choice number one not an option? Because in a patriarchal system, or in a system where divorce is very stigmatic, or when you have children, and it's not easy for men to choose to divorce either, but in very patriarchal societies, they're in a better position. So when you're already in a position of some sort of feeling of oppression, you have to be able to kind of deal with because in the best situation, if you're in an unhealthy marriage, healthy people will leave an unhealthy marriage. If you're healthy, you're not going to deal with being, mistreated or abused or having your trust constantly be betrayed. Unless your partner is doing real work to change. If they're not interested in changing, your choice is to not put up with it or to somehow change yourself. And then the question is, how do you do that? I think that this book provides a way. Is this a path towards real intimacy? I don't think so. It's a path towards real survival.
Yeah, real survival is a good way to put it. If anything, it almost seems to me that this idea of look at yourself and see what kind of tikkun it is for you almost makes you enclosed.
It's a way to survive.
Well, it makes you enclosed within yourself. Put up a shield. It's the opposite of intimacy. You're no longer even looking at your partner anymore. You're looking in the opposite direction, saying it has nothing to do with you. It has to do with me and God, and you're not really part of this conversation. You're just a tool that God is using in order to send me a message or to fix something that's wrong in me. I think it's almost the opposite of intimate.
I think that at the end of the day, if we look at the responses and the people who are listening to this, and I am sure that this episode is going to stimulate a lot of discussion and we're going to be getting letters. And I think that what we have to acknowledge is that even our reactions to this topic come from somewhere. If we find ourselves listening to this and feeling very reactive, and there are some very strong reactions to this. Number one, I think we have to really acknowledge that there are women out there who this has really been helpful to them. And it hasn't been dangerous for them. It's actually helped them. And if you are one of those women out there, I am not. We are not here to devalue your experience. For those women who have felt that this has really been helpful for them and they are happy and satisfied, then that's great. This is a New York Times bestseller for a reason. It has helped many women, and we have to acknowledge that. It really also depends on what kind of marriage are you looking for also. And if you're looking for something that isn't about trying to get there by manipulating in some way or creating a reality on the ground, but by real couples journey, a real couples journey of communication. Communication is so important. And that was one of the things, just don't communicate so much, but communication is really important. And the belief that men are not incapable of identifying their emotions. It's only the culture that has, the society that has told men, that has socialized men to believe that they're not allowed to express their feelings. But when you can have a partner with feelings, and by the way, I've seen many couples where it's Dafka the man who is far more interested in talking, far more interested in sharing his feelings, and the woman is not. So again, let's try to get away from the gender stereotypes. And let's really realize that this really brings up a lot of emotions, because there are many people out there who do get triggered by the book because of their own feelings of anger over their own instances of feeling oppressed by the system. So for women that it really helps give them a mechanism for surviving, it's great. And for other couples, it doesn't work that well. But it's really important that we are putting out there kind of a more nuanced approach to this, a way that we kind of frame it and understand it, and not make a blanket statement one way or the other that this is bad or this is good, because that's just certainly not how my mind works.
Yeah, we're certainly on the same page when it comes to that. Okay, Tali, this was a great episode. A lot to talk about, I'm sure. As Tali said, we're going to get a lot of feedback. Remember to write to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com and let us know what you think. Visit our website, intimatejudaism.com. Become a Patreon member. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And one more exciting announcement, Tali and I will be having a live event on June 7th in Beit Shemesh. It's an Iriya event brought to you by the Binyamin Library in the Meyerhoff Matnas. Exact details will be posted on our Facebook page, so make sure to check that out there. It should be a lot of fun. We'll be talking about Tali's book that she co-wrote with David Ribner, Ani L'Dodi, I Am For My Beloved. Again, that's on June 7th, so check that out as well. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.